Hey everyone, welcome to our Vancouver Eastside Vineyard teaching time for Sunday, January the 31st. Mission Central Weekend. I hope you're enjoying the events. And what a week we've had in our church as well. Just sending a big love and greeting to Scott and to Kim and to Rick up in the Mount St. Joseph's Hospital. Sending our love to you guys and love to all of you. Thank you for being the embodiment of God this week as a church. I want to begin today with a story of when I was a child. I was a preschooler. I know that. I wasn't in school yet. I think we were still living in Vulcan, Alberta, but we were visiting my grandparents, which we did once or twice a year, and it was, I think, Christmas time because we were downtown in a very busy shopping area, and we were coming out of one of these big department stores like Woodward's or the Bay or something. And as a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, I was pretty enthralled with these automatic opening doors that open by themselves. And I walked out ahead of my parents and turned around to try to see them. And I all of a sudden recognized that there was nobody that I knew. And I panicked. I turned around again and cried out, "Mommy, Daddy," or something like that. And just at that moment, I saw them. They were right behind me. And even though I'd lost sight of them, they had never lost sight of me. And I can't describe the sense of relief that came over me as I'd felt this lostness and then foundness. And I think this experience, I can't think of a better way to describe what I think happened to Nathaniel in our gospel reading today. From John chapter 1, verses 43 to 51, which we've already read from. And this is part of our ongoing teaching series that we're in called Embodiment. Seeing the good news through the eyes of John the Beloved, who had a front row seat to the most incredible event in human history. And that was that the Creator joined the creation by becoming embodied, by becoming a human being in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, in order that God could be known. God's longed to be known. And John is writing this not from an immediate perspective, but from decades of reflection, and now as an elder. And from the perspective that that embodiment didn't stop with Jesus, but continues now through us, his people, the church. And so it's with those reflections that John is writing. And speaking of embodiment, one of the strong themes that comes out early in the book of John and continues through the whole book is this theme of witness. And it begins almost in the first few verses when John the Baptist is described as a witness. John wrote, he was not the light, but he came as a witness to bear witness to the light, so that through him all might believe. That's quite a statement about John's witness. And of course, we saw that fulfilled through the story that Nathan so beautifully talked about last week, where it was John's disciples who became the first disciples of Jesus. For they saw Jesus walking by one day, about 6 weeks after he'd been baptized and already been in the wilderness. And John pointed Jesus out to some of his disciples, to Andrew and to another unnamed disciple that probably was John the Beloved. And he said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And these two disciples took off and began to follow Jesus. And Jesus turned around to them and said, "What do you want?" And they said, "Well, Rabbi, where do you live?" And he said to them, "Come and see. Come and see." And then they spent the rest of the day with Jesus. And somewhere during that time, Andrew went off, and it says he found his brother Peter. That word "found" begins to appear constantly in the next few verses. Note that he found his brother Peter and brought him to Jesus and introduced him. Then the scriptures tell us in our reading today that the very next day, and I forgot to mention that Andrew said to Peter, "We have found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. So already that word found appears twice. And this idea continues in our text today because it says that the very next day, Jesus left this area of the Jordan, which Kathleen and I have been there, by the way. I've actually baptized people in the same traditional spot where John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Quite an experience. And so they headed north to Galilee. And Galilee was the home territory where Jesus lived. And actually these three disciples, Peter, John, and James, also were from Galilee. And they were from a town called Bethsaida, which was a fisherman village on the seashore of Galilee. And it may have been actually a stop at that village where Jesus, it says, found, there it is again, Philip. So we have Peter and John and Andrew and Philip, all from this little town of Bethsaida. And Jesus says to Philip, follow me. So Philip does, but it says immediately he went and found his friend Nathanael. Now Nathanael, who we focus on in our text today, was not from Bethsaida, but from, we learn later in John, was from Cana of Galilee. Remember Cana? That famous place where Jesus turned the water into wine, his first miracle, which will happen in our story next week. He found Nathanael, and here's what he said: we have found the Messiah, the one that Moses wrote about in the law and the prophets, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Well, everything was going pretty positive up to that point until Philip mentioned that Jesus was from Nazareth. And all of a sudden, Nathanael's countenance fell. And he said these words, Nazareth, can any good thing come from there? Let alone the Messiah. Can any good thing at all come from there? So we pick up immediately. There's actually no nice way to say this. There's an obvious bias that Nathanael is feeling about this place called Nazareth. And we all know that. We all have our rivalries, and we look down at certain communities that are notorious for certain things. And we're not sure exactly what the bias was against Nazareth. We do know that Galilee in general was looked down by the rest of the Jews as Galilee of the Gentiles. That was a slur, and it's called that actually in the Gospels. So it's possible that Nazareth had a bad reputation, but it's more likely that Nazareth was just plain boring. It was just so ordinary. It wasn't glamorous like LA or New York or Jerusalem in their time. And how could something so amazing come from a place so ordinary? And this was one of the biggest barriers that Jesus faced in his home territory. It was his ordinariness. That, in fact, any time in the Gospels, did you notice that when he's called the son of Joseph, it's never in a positive light. It's always it's like demeaning, the carpenter's son. It's like a put down. And in order to see God, there is bias and prejudice often that has to be overcome. You know, there's a lot of people that have prejudice to seeing God and seeing Jesus because of bad experiences they've had with the church. They've been hurt. And whatever the bias was and the prejudice was that Nathanael was experiencing, I love Philip's approach. He says the phrase again that we heard earlier today and last week, come and see. Come and see. He doesn't argue with him. He doesn't try to talk him out of his bias, his hurt, his woundedness. He just is a friend. He's present with him, and he just says, hey, come and hang out. Come and see. And that word see is a profound word. It's not just physically see. It's actually come and move from what you see to insight. Move from sight to insight by just hanging out. And I love that, Nathanael's approach, or Philip's approach with his friend, Nathanael. So to Nathanael's credit, he was open to coming and seeing. He was willing to overcome whatever emotional bias and discomfort he may have felt about checking out a Messiah from Nazareth. And Jesus was obviously impressed with this because when he saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And we see in the text right away, Nathanael almost gasps with astonishment. And he says, "How do you know me?" Well, what was the nature of the astonishment that Nathanael was feeling in this moment? Well, Jesus then says to him, "Well, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." And if he was astonished before, by now he's totally in shock. And he cries out, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." These terms, Son of God and King of Israel, were common terms for the Messiah in the Old Testament. Son of God, of course, from Psalm 2, "You are my son. Today I've begotten you." And the Messiah was seen as the King of Israel. So what was so astonishing to Nathanael? What so got him in this text? And how did he move from skepticism to faith so quickly? Well, much commentary has been written about the significance of the fig tree. And you know the Old Testament, under the vine and fig tree, which Amanda Gorman mentioned in her inaugural poem last week, is quite a famous phrase. And we can get so caught up in that we miss the forest for the proverbial tree, the fig tree. So yes, I could talk about being under the fig tree. It was actually an idiom or an expression that commonly meant for a Jewish person or an Israelite to be meditating in silence and solitude on the Torah. This was a common term. So it's likely that Nathanael was indeed doing that at that very moment. But I think what's shocking to him is when Jesus said, "You are a true Israelite." And in about 3 verses, Jesus addresses about 3 chapters in the book of Genesis that seem to indicate that that is exactly what Nathanael was meditating on. The first thing he says, "You're a true Israelite in whom there is no guile or deceit or deceptiveness or hooks." And it's an immediate reference to the story of Jacob, whose name meant deceiver and person of guile, who wrestled with God one night. And at the end of that wrestling match, he lost, by the way. But he said, "I won't let you go until you bless me." And God asked him his name, and he said, "My name is Deceiver," or Jacob. And God said, "You are no longer a deceiver, but you are Israel, one who struggles with God." And in saying to Nathanael, "You are an Israelite," he was including him in the story and telling him that he was one who struggles with God, and it's good. So Nathanael he's astonished by that. But then Jesus goes further and he says, "You believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree, but you will see greater things than that." And then he added, "Very truly I tell you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man," or the human one, the embodied one, the one who embodied God. You will see. And he's referring to this famous story, of course, again in the same context of Jacob and his journeys, where he was running from Esau, his brother, and he laid down to sleep, and he put his head on a rock for a pillow. And he had a dream, and he saw the angels ascending and descending. And on this ladder between heaven and earth. And on top of this ladder was God. And God spoke to Jacob. And he said to him, promised him, "I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to finish your story. I've got your back. And I'm going to bring you back to this land." And Jacob woke up and he looked around and everything was ordinary again. No ladder, no vision. But he said, "Surely God is in this place." But I wasn't aware of it. And Jesus said to Nathanael, "You will see this." Well, we know Nathanael never literally saw that. He didn't literally see a ladder between heaven and earth and angels, as far as we know. but he saw the embodied one. He saw God in the flesh, the Word become flesh. That was the ladder between heaven and earth. That was where heaven invaded earth in the Son of God, the Son of Man, the human one. And what's so profound about this is not that Jesus knew what Nathanael had been meditating on, but it's that he was including Nathanael in the story. You are in this story, Nathanael. And I think Nathanael became overwhelmed with the fact that at that moment he hadn't found Jesus. Jesus had found him. He knew and loved Jesus because Jesus first knew and loved him. He hadn't chosen Jesus, but Jesus had first chosen him. Now, historically, Nathanael became part of the story. We know that. We're not sure if he was one of the 12 disciples or whether he was one of the 70, because he never appears in the lists of the 12 in the other Gospels. However, a lot of scholars believe that Nathanael was actually Bartholomew, because Bartholomew is actually a family name. Bar, meaning son of, and Ptolemy is the name of his father. So Nathanael could very well have meant his given name, which is gift of God. And whether he was part of the 70 or part of the 12, or whether it's one of us here 2,000 years later, the fact is we're called to bear witness, to be the embodiment, the ongoing embodiment of God in the earth, to be that ladder where heaven and earth meet, where the angels ascend and descend, and where God says, I've got your back. Nathanael felt included in this river. He all of a sudden realized it really wasn't up to him, that all he needed to do was go with that current of God's love and grace and not resist it and not fight it. I want to close with a story of one of our homestay daughters. Her name is Unsu, not Insu, but Unsu. We always had trouble saying her name. One of the few times. I got most of the Korean names. But this one, so we called her Sue. And she came to live with us, a university student, to live with us for a few months to learn English a few years ago. And Sue was one of these Koreans that had many bad experiences with Christians. She told us later that they had been pushy. They were always pushy. They had a reputation of being aggressive on the transit and in the street corners. So she avoided them like the plague. She was a professed atheist. And so when she found out that we were pastors, she asked the agency in Korea to find her another place. She had some biases that she needed to overcome. And the agency and one of the directors who we'd met here in Vancouver told her, well, check it out. Check their profile out online. And we had a kind of a developed picture and profile. And she said the moment she saw her photo, she felt this sense of warmth come over her. So she said to them, okay, well, I'll give it a try. She told us later when she arrived at the door of our house and we welcomed her in her home, that same sense of warmth enveloped her. And we took her into our home, of course, and loved her as a member of our own family, as a daughter. And to our surprise, we knew a little bit about her background and what to expect. And to our surprise, within a few days, she invited herself to church. And we were quite surprised about this because we actually don't overtly invite people to church. We, of course, let them know they're invited and we love for them to come. But we don't want them to feel that that's some kind of condition about being loved in our home and being a family member. We just want to love people where they are. Kathleen and I have had this policy from St. Francis of Assisi. Preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. In other words, we want to live the life. That's what we want our witness to be. And so Sue began to attend our church and became part of the life of our community and had a very profound encounter with God where she told us that she had this sense of these eyes that were always constantly on her. Not in a scary way, but in a loving way, as in Psalm 32, I will guide you with my loving eye. It was the eye that I felt with my parents when they were still looking at me, even though I'd lost them. She felt these eyes. And so she had this profound experience. And so she began to become part of our church. And I would later tease her about her inviting herself to church. She was kind of pushy. and one night she was concerned. She got news about her boyfriend on the DMZ, the demilitarized zone of North Korea. And there was a skirmish going on, and his life was in danger. And so we got together right here, right where I'm sitting right now, and we prayed in this living room. And I just felt led to ask her to pray. And it was the first prayer that I'd ever heard her pray. And I'm so glad I did, because she went like this. Jesus. Damn, Jesus. And that's about all she could say. But it was like this cry that came from her heart. And the next day, that situation on the DMZ had settled right down. I think God heard her cry. And a couple of years later, we had the privilege of meeting her parents in Seoul, Korea. They took us out to this very fancy Korean restaurant in Insadong area of Seoul. And with tears in their eye, with Sue as an interpreter, they said to us, why did you love our daughter so much? Well, what could we say? I mean, how could we not love one that was so adorable? But we knew, and they knew, through Sue's translation, that it was because we were in the current. We were in that river, and we knew that we were loved. We loved because we were first loved by God. And Sue knew she was known and loved. And like Nathaniel, she was willing to overcome her prejudice to come and to see. So embodiment is this. Surely the Lord is in this place, even when we're not aware. Before we found Jesus, he found us. Before we chose Jesus, he chose us. Before we ever knew and loved Jesus, he knew and loved us. And as his witnesses, we have this sacred trust of embodying that love and that message to our families, to our friends, to our neighbors, and yes, to our enemies as well. For God so loved the whole world, not just the elect, not just white people, not just middle-class people, not just our type, but God so loved the whole world that he gave his one and only Son, not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. So along with his blessing, which is how I usually end, I want to close with a thank you to you, my dear, precious church family, because I'm so deeply moved when I witness over and over again the way that you love, the way that you are the embodiment of God in this time, in this place. So I say to you, thank you, thank you, thank you. God bless you.